and then I'll give it just a couple of seconds so that we can make sure everybody can hear me. All right, well, here we are. Welcome. Those of you in attendance in person, thank you for being here. We greatly appreciate it. Welcome to those who are attending online. Thank you for making time for this. We know that everybody involved has a vested interest in maintaining the number of examiners that is necessary to get the number of people you need to drive school buses at your operations. So we are, number one, grateful for the work that you do. I know it's not an easy job. With that, maybe I should introduce myself. My name is Brock Dittis. I'm the Operations and Policy Analyst here at the Department of Education with the Pupil Transportation Unit. I work with Craig Pruitt and Scott Bull, whom you know already. If you haven't met me in person, I look forward to the next time that we do. We've got some folks in attendance here from various districts around the state. We've got, again, other folks online. But yes, my name is Brock. I'll introduce, this is Candace Pelt. Candace is the Assistant Superintendent of Student Services, and she fills the role that Sarah Drinkwater was formerly in. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being there.
Yeah.
And then to my right and your left, we've got Bryce McKenna with DMV, and your title is on the screen. I'll have to refresh my memory here. You are the Driver Programs Manager. And then Nick Hopper, Third-Party Programs Compliance Coordinator. Both of you have been working on changes coming up to the third-party examiner program. So we've got you in here today to share some of the details about that. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Before we proceed, also wanted to give a big thanks to our technical team. We've got Shauna, Flo, and Kylie from my unit who have been working the tech. We would not be here without them, so thank you very much for your help. And then Mary and Heather, who both had to step away, they gave us additional technical assistance to make sure that everybody on the internet can see and hear us. So with that, let me move to our next slide here. Nick, could you just click on that screen there real quick, right in the middle of the presentation? Thank you. I think that's what I need. There we go. So all of you who work in student or pupil transportation, you're very familiar with the road to a bus driver's credentials. There are many steps from the beginning to the end of the process, and what we're going to talk about today affects that slightly, but the basic steps that you're familiar with, we've got the new driver. Once someone agrees to work for your operation, that is a good thing. That is the first in a series of more difficult processes that end up in a good thing, which is a driver working for you in your operation. So just to recap, as you're all aware, but I'll go over it for the sake of being complete. Once you hire your new driver, they need to go see a physician to make sure they can pass their physical exam and that they have been approved as medically fit to drive a school bus. So that's a federal requirement. There's no getting around that one. Once that has happened, then they go to the DMV, they get their commercial learner's permit, and then they may begin training as a school bus driver. They'll do that with you at your operation with one of your ODE certified trainers. We do 15 hours behind the wheel before they are allowed to be an Oregon school bus driver. To be an Oregon school bus driver, you also have to be a commercially licensed driver in the state of Oregon through the DMV. So before they're approved to drive, they will take an exam with an examiner, most often a third-party examiner, when they're a school bus driver at your operation. So we've got the commercial driver license test, which is done by that third-party examiner most times. If it is done anywhere else and it's not with a certified behind-the-wheel trainer through the Department of Education, they would also have to take a school bus test. But for most places and in most cases, that's done at the same time. So your commercial license is tested for at the same time that your school bus certificate is tested for. And barring any issues, any problems with that test, once they pass, they become a driver at your operation. And again, we go from good thing candidate to a good thing driver. So that's how it's been. And we're going to talk about some of the changes that are coming up. We've got a few small pieces to this process that are going to be a little bit different going into the future than they have been historically. And so that's why we've brought in Bryce and Nick to explain some of these changes. So Is there anything you'd like to say in the way of preface, or shall I give you your first slide?
I think the first slide.
All right.
All right, so the visual that you're looking at right now is the current skills testing structure, wherein ODE DMV contracts directly with the Oregon Department of Education, who then has agreements in place with the various school districts and private bus companies to administer CDL skills tests. Some of the that process currently contains a combination of the certification for school bus driver as well as the licensure requirements for a CDL. Next slide. Oh, clicker, perfect. Got it, thank you. So this is what it's going to look like more in the future as we get down the road. While ODE and DMV will continue to support various aspects of this program, there isn't going to be the intermediate layer that used to exist, and that ODE DMV will be contracting directly with school districts and private bus companies. It's going to look and feel kind of similar to what we have going on right now, but there are going to be a few key differences as we go through this process. Currently, right now, what we're looking at is entering into governmental agreements with the government agencies in the form of, excuse me, public school districts, and then contractual agreements with the actual private bus companies.
So before you go on to the next slide, actually, that's okay. I'm just going to add a little bit on here. If any of you have any questions about why this is, I did send an email out to all of the school districts and bus companies that kind of explain a little bit, more behind the why we're having to do this. But the long and short of it is that the historical structure of the way this has existed started a long time ago. Statutes changed. We didn't do a good job at DMV of monitoring to make sure that our structure was compliant with federal and state regulations. So ODE acting as an intermediary as far as CDL skills test licensure is concerned, it became really clear that we couldn't continue with that structure going forward, that we had to enter into these direct relationships with the private bus companies and the school districts, the entities who actually employ the examiners who are administering the tests. So whatever that entity is, be it public or private, those have to function as the skills testing entities going forward, instead of ODE functioning as that skills testing third-party entity. So without getting into too much of the regulatory details, that's really kind of what we're needing to do, and that's why we're having this informational session to kind of elaborate a little bit more on that. Go ahead.
Thanks, Bryce.
And let me just share also, we'll take some questions both from those in attendance physically as well as those on the internet. So if there's anything that doesn't make sense by the time we get to the end of our presentation, we'll have a time for questions then. Perfect.
All right, so this slide kind of highlights the third-party tester duties, obligations, responsibilities, references the applicable Division 60 administrative rules, which covers third-party testing, all third-party testing for the state, in addition to reference for the applicable federal regulations as they apply to third-party testing. And essentially with the regulations, as Bryce alluded to, that's kind of what we're trying to sync up with a little bit more of the intent of the actual program, the nature of these relationships, and how we all work together. See, I think we've got additional notes. Click.
Actually, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on that one too here, just really quickly before we move on. The point of this slide is really to make it clear that there are things that the entities that function as third-party skills testing entities, there are things that they are required to do. So this is just kind of like disclosure. For all of those school districts and bus companies that want to function as third-party testing entities, there are certain responsibilities that both ODE DMV and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration expects those third-party entities to do. If they're private entities, absolutely have to have the appropriate insurance coverages and surety bond in place. And those are federal requirements, and as well as state requirements. And then whether, I don't know exactly how all the school districts function, but I know, that like there are some charter schools and private schools and all of those types of things. But depending on the definition of whether a body constitutes a unit of local government, and a public body will determine whether we have to enter into intergovernmental agreements or actual contracts with those entities. And whether or not they're covered by the Oregon Tort Claims Act and are self-insured, that will determine whether we have to verify the insurance and the surety bond requirements are met and those things. So there are these expectations of the third-party testing entities. One, that they enter into agreements with ODE DMV for the administration of the skills tests. Two, that they make sure that whatever insurance coverages or exemption from insurance coverages they have are in place and that they have the appropriate surety bond. Three, that they're operating a program that is compliant with all state and federal regulations. So while we do some compliance work to ensure that our third-party testers and our third-party examiners are doing what they're supposed to be doing, the responsibility for making sure that this third-party testing program in each area is doing what they're supposed to do, that kind of falls to that organization, that third-party testing organization. So there are some responsibilities that come with being a third-party tester. When we refer to third-party tester, that's the organization or the entity. The third-party examiner is the employee who actually administers the test working for the third-party tester.
And thank you for clearing that up,
Yes.
because the language can get sticky. You don't know exactly which words you're using or supposed to use. So yes, again, third-party tester is the organization allowed to do third-party examinations by DMV, and the examiner is the person doing those examinations.
All right, so brass tacks, what it boils down to for everybody, we kind of cover some of the items and what's changing. These are the noticeable differences that you're going to see as we move forward. As we've stated, the actual bus companies in the school districts will now contract directly with DMV, rather than being a subsidiary of the Oregon Department of Education who contracts with DMV. Contracts and agreements, since it's an actual contractual process, the maximum term is actually going to go out to 10 years. Those will be in 2 to 5 year intervals as far as renewals are concerned. The application process, as you know it, will also be changed. We'll get to that as we talk about examiners. Bus companies and districts will be responsible for maintaining the requirements of the third-party testing business. And those were the requirements that Bryce was just talking about. You'll have a more active role involved with your examiners, ensuring that they're doing all of the things that they need to be doing, as well as meeting any of the insurance bonding requirements, anything of that nature. Required insurance coverages, surety bonds. For the examiners, one of the big differences, there will no longer be an application process. So having to fill out these applications every 2 years and doing virtually 100 of them or near 100 of them every couple of years, we won't have to do, because they'll be operating employees as employees of their employer. Their employer is going to do the contract piece with us, and then by being employed with them, you're essentially an extension of that business. Must be employed under an entity in contract with us, as well as one exam for CDL and school bus certification. That's the continued goal moving forward. We don't know everything about what that's going to look like. We do know that aspects of the test will be changing eventually, which is part of this piece as well, but we don't know exactly what yet until we have some more confirmation from the FMCSA. Bryce, anything you want to add?
Just, yeah, really quickly, and we'll elaborate on this in an upcoming slide, but since it's here, we'll go ahead and bring this up now. So there have been a lot of questions recently about examiners testing for other than their employer. And once again, we'll get into that here in a moment. That's certainly allowable in certain circumstances, but in some of the ways that it's been done historically across the state, there are certain ways that it was being done that's not okay. And as a for instance, if I'm an examiner, a third-party examiner working for a school district, and I'm going to administer tests for another district out of my immediate geographic area and not for my actual employer, and if I go do those tests on my evenings or weekends or something of that nature, it's not on my paid work time with my employer, all of a sudden I'm administering tests. I'm not covered by my employer's insurance. I'm not covered by workers' comp. I'm not covered by their general liability insurance or their exemption from that insurance, whatever. Basically, I'm kind of operating as a freelancer at that point, right? So that creates a lot of problems from a oversight and compliance issue. Now, if I'm on my on-duty time for my employer and I'm administering a test for another district, perfectly fine, right? If I've worked it out with my employer, and I've done the whole conflict of interest review and my employer determines it's okay, I take a second job for a private for-profit third-party testing entity and I function as an examiner under that private for-profit third-party testing entity, now I can go administer those skills tests on my evenings and weekends because I'm doing it for a third-party testing entity under contract with DMV, right? And I'm doing it as part of my employment with this other entity covered by their insurance, their workers' comp, all of those types of things. Another option would be as a third-party examiner, if I think there's enough business that I could, have this second job, I might want to be myself a third-party tester, a third-party testing entity, in which case I could enter into contract directly with DMV and I could administer tests on my days off, weekends, evenings, whatever. So there are a number of different ways that could still happen. It just has to be done, once again, under the employment for a third-party tester covered by all the appropriate insurances. And once again, we'll cover that again enough. And I probably just stole the thunder from the upcoming slide. But... Right. Oh, there it is.
Yeah,
so
continued what's changing for you. So Bryce already hit on this a little bit. I don't necessarily have a lot to add in that regard. But basically just that. There will still be potential opportunities for individuals that have done that in the past to potentially do it in the future. Obviously, it'll have to make sense for them to carry the necessary coverages and do all of those things on their own. But that is always a possibility for anyone to enter into contract with us to administer CDL skills tests.
Is it okay if I just to illustrate again, you covered kind of the reasons why this would be the case, but it's also very important to make sure that if you're out there doing an exam for somebody, you want to make sure that if the bus goes off the road and destroys a barn, that you're not the person that has to rebuild that barn. You have insurance that takes care of that. And so maybe that's a silly example, but we want to make sure that if something is happening, that again, the appropriate coverages are there. You don't want to be in a position where you have to pay for that new barn.
And we certainly don't want to discourage. Actually, we want to do the opposite. We want to encourage, actually, cooperation across districts, especially in rural areas, because there's going to be a need for an examiner to potentially need to cover a broader geographic area than is covered by their employer. And if there are arrangements that can be worked out between one school district or a bus company and surrounding geographic areas for that examiner to provide services, and then that district, that home district that employs that examiner, bills those other districts for the use of that person's time, great. And that's not a problem, and that can be worked out between that, one district or District A and District B, and that's perfectly fine. And we would encourage that because, that helps us ensure that we have statewide coverage for examiners across the state. And so certainly something that we don't want to discourage. Once again, it just needs to be done properly.
Perfect. In addition to some of the intermediary roles that ODE has helped support, in the actual CDL testing side of things, which include route approvals, questions you have about systems entry or logging into systems, or specific test administration questions, those will all come directly to DMV third-party program support, which be myself, Stephen Ray, Wade Brazil, or whoever our pending administrative specialist is once we get one on board.
And for any of those of you who don't know what systems is, it's the Commercial Skills Test Information Management System, the computer application where all the examiners are entering scheduled tests and test results. So just in case there's anybody on the line who is not familiar with what that abbreviation means.
All right. Anything else you'd like to add, Bryce? All right. So we started to talk about this a little bit as well. Sometime in the next couple of years, school districts, bus companies will be required to modify skills tests administered for school bus drivers to comply with federal regulations. There are some very minor differences that we've found between the current skills test that's administered to school bus drivers and the one that DMV does as prescribed by the feds, essentially. The FMCSA, the regulatory agency that's responsible for oversight of the CDL program at the state level with DMV, has identified and is aware of some of those differences. We're currently in the findings process, which means they've found something. It's going to be a topic that's discussed down the road, and we may have to do some things on our end to make some adjustments to kind of sync the two back up in whatever areas they identify. Most of the changes we suspect will be minor. The differences that we know of already are pretty minor. And we'll work together to try and continue to ensure that there's only one test administered that meets both of the requirements for both programs. So we recognize the number of tests that are administered, the number of drivers that are going out there, to essentially double the workload burden by administering 2 completely separate tests for each driver isn't anything that anybody wants.
And also for anyone who has their commercial license, anybody who's done school bus driving in the past, if you're in an administrative position now, but you once were a school bus driver, you remember how difficult and how stressful it is to prepare for a commercial test. And it seems fair to set up a situation where people only have to do that once, if at all possible.
And there are a lot of different permutations this could take, but ultimately, the goal and the expectation that FMCSA has is that the test that's administered for licensure, for CDL licensure, should be uniform regardless of who that driver goes to, whether it's a DMV employed examiner, a private for-profit third-party examiner, or an examiner in ODE's program or with the school districts or the bus companies. And it's supposed to be administered the same and scored the same, right? So, you know, the fact that we have this test that accomplishes 2 things, CDL licensure and the school bus driver certification, if there are certain components of that need to get kind of extricated out, then what this, you know, could potentially look like is we have a pre-trip inspection, a basic control skills test, and an on-road driving test, which is just like a driver would get from any other examiner, and that's scored appropriately and everything's entered in systems. And if there are additional specific things that need to be done for the school bus driver certification program, those could be done at the end, right? Or beforehand, whatever. Just so that it's kind of extricated out from the beginning of the CDL skills test for licensure and the end of that skills test for licensure. And once again, we have standardized scoring. That you know, that's going to be the expectation that FMCSA has for ultimately what we come up with, or when we make some modifications or changes to the way that test is administered.
And to expand upon that a little bit too, it's not just limited to operation of vehicle type, meaning if someone has a Class B with passenger and school bus endorsement, they're also effectively licensed to go operate a dump truck. But it's also cross-jurisdictional in that these skills are transferable across states because it's a federal program, meaning the feds have an expectation that the test that they've prescribed as the federal model essentially stays the same across jurisdiction to ensure that if someone goes from one state to another, they maintain licensure.
Can I jump in with a question real quick?
Sure.
Someone wanted to know what the differences were that you all found. I'm thinking those were the changes.
Oh, that's a great question. I think high level right now we have 8 or 9. One of the key differences is the use of a pre-trip inspection memory aid. I'm trying to pull them off the top of my head. There are some differences within the air brakes leak test as is it administered, engine off versus engine running. And there's some other criteria, but we are happy to provide that information. I believe there's not anything that says we can't. So follow up. If you want, go ahead and follow up with contact information provided in the slide, and I can send you a list.
Yeah, and if we don't mind holding questions just until we're done with the presentation content, we may address some of the questions that come up before we're done. So we'll take questions at the end.
All right, so what isn't changing? ODE is going to continue to support all aspects of the school bus certification program, which is connected to but independent of DMV CDL skills test. So these kind of hit and key on some of those finer differences, some of the training aspects. I don't necessarily want to steal your thunder in this regard, but it's there are some additional requirements above and beyond the CDL skills test that ODE meets those needs and will continue to do so. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Brock.
Sure, yeah. Just everyone that is in the school bus industry is very familiar with the requirements ODE has for school bus drivers specifically, and those requirements aren't changing. In addition to examination, we also train school bus trainers. In order to train someone as a school bus driver, you have to be an ODE certified trainer. That's not changing. And yeah, all of the regulations that are currently in force for school bus drivers specifically will remain to be the same. Any changes in those things would come through the pipe the way that they usually would for you from us.
All right. Anything else to add? ODE will continue to provide skills test examiner training and support for the examiner evaluation process, which will include different training offerings throughout the year, as well as continued group evaluation process at the Oregon School for the Deaf with DMV evaluators. So I know many of you know about this. We've had kind of a, excuse me, we've had a process change as far as how we conduct evaluations. And the reason why we've changed some of this is to kind of meet a greater need among examiners. Not only has the forum changed to an on-site few times a year rather than visiting everyone at their each individual site, but the style and the format of it too, and that it's more of an opportunity to learn together, discuss together. We have been getting all kinds of feedback from that new process. Most of it has been positive. There's been a handful of folks, I think, that are really struggling with the travel piece of it and coming in versus having us come out to you. But primarily, most of the feedback we've been receiving to this point has been positive. As far as the different training offerings throughout the year, Brock, I don't know if you want to speak to that piece at all.
Yeah, in the past, we've done a examiner training in the summer for anyone who wants to become a third-party examiner. Most people who participate in that class begin as inactive examiners, and then they're ready to step up and fill that role when an active examiner needs to step down. So we will continue to provide that. This summer, we'll be running a third-party examiner course again because it's in our interest and it's in the interest of all of the school districts we work with to make sure that you have access to examiners when you need them. So we're going to continue to offer that service in this summer and going forward.
Anything else to add?
No, just well, actually, yeah, one thing, just and we're going to be taking a look at that examiner training, and we'll have we already had kind of initial conversation with Brock, but as Nick pointed out, once someone gets that CDL, once they get licensed, they're not just licensed to drive that school bus, right? They could drive other types of Class B vehicles. So it's really important that we ensure that whatever examiner training the individuals are getting would cover all of the things that FMCSA expects a person to have covered when they get licensed. So once again, although the focus of this entire process is on people who are prospective school bus drivers, the likelihood that these people, knowing that there's some churn, there's some turnover, there's some attrition, these people go on and do other things, that it's very likely that they could go out and do some other type of commercial driving. And we want, it's up to us to ensure that we do our due diligence to make sure they're prepared to operate different types of vehicles, not just the school buses, when it comes to the administration of the test for licensure, at least that component of it.
So I believe it was Bryce that alluded to this earlier as well. Some of the districts may not have the desire, the infrastructure to function as a third-party tester and maintain their own skills test examiners. Of course, along with the convenience comes expenses. We've alluded to some of them in the forms of insurance, bonding, as well as maintaining certifications, training, sending folks in for evaluations. All of these things take a financial toll on whatever organization. And I think it really highlights the fact that the entities that choose not to be a part of the program going forward because of those additional expenses, that everyone really kind of try and do our best to help support the need for drivers across the state. We're going to need as much collaboration as humanly possible here, I think. But I don't anticipate, again, this is assuming that some folks will want to maintain involvement. There's not going to be any cap or limitations on how many people get in or anything like that, and that any testing business that can meet the requirements of a testing business will be welcome into the program.
Yeah, so, and there are options if things are just not working well, right? In certain rural, isolated geographic areas of the state, some of them aren't very pretty, but, when it comes right down to it, if a person in an outlying area absolutely cannot get a test administered from an examiner under ODE's program, right, that an examiner working for a school district or a bus company, they can go take their CDL test for licensure from a DMV employed examiner. The wait may be really long right now, unfortunately. I mean, we're not doing well with the number of examiners we have and the capacity we have to administer CDL skills tests, but that's an option.
And in that situation, just making the distinction between a commercial license and a school bus certificate, that means somebody would have to test for their school bus certificate separately, but it is an option.
Yeah.
Also, on the third-party coverage, looking at our rural spaces, this is an area that ODE will step in with technical assistance and provide support, so a district can think about opportunities to recoup those costs if they decide to have an examiner on site, and how to have different agreements with different entities and agencies to gather that. And so one of the things you can do is contact Brock and myself, and we'll come out and sit with you.
So other things we've discussed, like, again, for licensure, testing with a DMV employed examiner, testing with a for-profit third-party testing business. Downside to that is going to be significantly more expensive, minimum $150, assuming that examiner doesn't have to travel. But we have some of our private for-profit third-party skills test examiners that have the appropriate qualifications to administer a test in a school bus. Some of those individuals may be willing to get certified in ODE's program to function as examiners, and serve that dual role. Because they're for-profit entities, there's going to have to be enough volume there for it to be worth their while, right? But we've kind of talked about that. Basically, we're throwing lots of different options up against the wall for trying to meet the need with this changing structure. And all of these things are potentialities, and how we could work them out. Once again, there may be some challenges, and it may not, in some cases, work out ideally across the state. But we're going to do all we can to mitigate the negative implications of these different options and try to find some creative ways to resolve issues if we do have some lapse in coverage. Because some of the other things we know we have, occasionally we have a problem where we have a single point of failure. We may have a single examiner who's qualified to administer tests in a certain area, and all of a sudden they leave. They quit, they go to work somewhere else, and it happens from time to time, they don't administer tests properly or something along those lines, and we end up having to suspend their examiner certificate or revoke their examiner certificate, and they can all of a sudden no longer administer tests. Well, who's going to cover that particular geographic area if there's a driver need? So, trying to think of that backup coverage as well, and different options that may be available. Once again, if we do have a single point of failure and that examiner ends up going away, how can we ensure that we can still get drivers tested? It's on our mind.
All right, so jumped ahead again.
Sorry.
Statewide test administration coverage, I'll just hit them all at a high level. Options include paying another district or bus company for use of their examiners to test your prospective drivers, permissible only if certain conditions are met. And Bryce touched on this a little bit earlier in the presentation, in that essentially they have to be operating in the line of employment covered by the appropriate insurances, workman's comp, all of those types of things as an employee of their testing business. And then any sort of reimbursement that needs to work its way back to the company itself would have to be done at the company level, not paying the person. Examiners qualified in ODE's program may take second jobs as skill test examiners with for-profit third-party testing businesses. That's something that Bryce had hit on. Examiners qualified in ODE's program may take second jobs by establishing their own third-party testing contract with DMV. So as part of this, and we haven't gotten a lot into the details of this aspect, but this isn't just a reworking of the structure and the agreements between Oregon DMV, Department of Education, the school districts, and bus companies. We're also doing a competitive contractual procurement process for all of our for-profit entities. We're hoping early summer, late spring, where we're going to go out for bid through procurement, solicit, try to get people to come back in, sign in as testing businesses. So that opportunity is going to open up for individuals out there that want to start a third-party testing business independent of this. Prospective school bus drivers may take their school CDL skills test from a DMV examiner, qualified private third-party examiner. Again, the big thing being, as Brock alluded to, is that there's still a separate school bus certification piece to that. So essentially those folks, at least in the interim, would have to take 2 tests. Of course, with DMV, everybody knows, quite a wait to get a test with the Oregon DMV. The expenses are less than third party, but the wait time is excessive. On the third party side, you have the reduced wait, but the increased expense.
And so here's another kind of angle on this and how this can potentially play out. There's a federal requirement that if Nick is a trainer, he's a driver trainer, and I am the prospective driver, I'm the applicant. If he trains me, he cannot also test me for the purposes of CDL licensure. However, under ODE's program, bus driver certification, That may or may not exist. That's not our call to make, right? That's their shop there. But say, for instance, if we're in a geographic area where coverage is tight, there aren't a whole lot of resources, and a driver absolutely has to go to a private for-profit third-party testing entity or a DMV employed examiner because the only person available in that area to test them is the same person who trained them, and that can't work for licensure, then we may have an instance where that person has to check their box for their CDL licensure with a DMV employed examiner or private third party just to have a different body administering the test than the one who trained them, right? And then whatever is done on the bus driver certification side is, once again, it's none of our concern. You know, we're not interested in getting in the middle of that. That's for ODE and the districts and the bus companies to manage. But, you know, we just got to make sure that as far as that test administration for licensure is concerned, that it's compliant with all the requirements.
Anything else, guys?
Not so far. Go ahead and continue. So I think that brings us to the end of your deck. If there's anything else you need to share as we go forward, I think we're getting close to the point where we can take questions. But I just wanted to put this up on the screen so everybody can see. This is, again, a visual representation similar to the one that you guys had in your deck, where we have slightly different relationships with you as the entities that we are. So the Department of Education is concerned with the things that affect your school bus certificate as a school bus driver. We're enabling the third-party examiner program. We're providing that training opportunity, but we're not administering it. But we are the ones that are, we're kind of overseeing the school bus side of things. And again, the Department of Transportation and the DMV are administering the actual structure and the authority for that third-party examination. I'll put this up again, just same thing we saw at the beginning. Our goal from both of our organizations is to be able to get you from that first good thing, the new driver candidate, to a fully tested, licensed, and certified bus driver that can do the work you need done. That's why we're here, and so we want to make sure that we're facilitating something that is as simple as possible for you as our partners, and something that is also compliant with the law. So at this point, Candace, can I have you explain just a little bit about some of our thoughts on why, as a small district, you might want to be a third-party examiner location?
I think one of the opportunities you have if you are both rural and a larger urban setting, so we can provide the technical assistance to recoup that cost if you are the entity that provides it, and it doesn't have to be during the employee's workday if they are also a driver for you. So one of the barriers we've heard is the examiner is a driver, so they can't be leaving to go to provide those exams in other spaces. So we will provide some assistance with you to understand the relationship and how you can contract as an entity or the district that hosts that, recoup that cost, and maintain this relationship. And so ongoing, just communication with us, and if that's something you're interested in, we can support you with.
Right. So we're going to have our contact information up, and I believe that might be, yes. This is kind of point persons for questions you might have. With that, I'll have us take some questions. I'm sure you all have some. I think we've got questions queued up online. At this point, no one has asked questions online yet. So if more show up, we'll be there. We'll take questions from the audience as well. After you ask the question, I'll repeat and or summarize just so that people who are tuning in from outside can hear it clearly.
So I think one of the biggest questions in our area is why the decision third-party examiners cannot give third-party examination tests to the smaller school districts anymore. What is the reasoning for that and the rationale?
So the question is why third-party examiners cannot
administer tests.
Do you mean independent of their employment? Okay.
So I can field this question. So actually, examiners can administer tests for other geographic areas, but it's got to be under their employment for a third-party testing entity under contract with DMV. So that's a federal requirement. That is also and I'm going to give you a for instance. If we have an examiner who is employed by a district and the they have their 40 hours a week or whatever they work for their district. And then outside of that employed time, they're going off and administering tests other places. They're not covered by workers' compensation. They're not covered by general liability insurance. If they're administering a test and there's a fatal accident, then there is nothing to protect the state or to protect that individual or to protect anyone from a lawsuit from the surviving member's family. So absolutely can't allow those types of things to happen, right? For a number of different reasons, not the least of which is that kind of legal risk and that tort claim and that lawsuit risk. The other part of it is if a person is, once again, administering tests outside of their employment from a entity, right now, currently, none of the school districts or bus companies are under contract with DMV, right? There's a pseudo memorandum of agreement that we did as a stopgap measure because we realized there were no formal subcontracts between ODE and the school districts and bus companies. We don't have a legal relationship still right now. We're legally deficient. The school districts and bus companies have to have direct contracts or intergovernmental agreements with us. We don't have that right now. I mean, we're still operating legally deficient from where we need to be. So we're already at risk allowing this to continue until we get, a legally sufficient process in place around, June or so of this year. We are under less risk, since we've done the things that we've done since last September, but, we still have some exposure. So until we get this right, and we have, once again, formal intergovernmental agreements that have to be reviewed by Department of Justice between us and the units of local government, and formal contracts with the private bus companies, we have a lot of legal exposure. And we've just been very fortunate that this hasn't bitten us in the last 3 decades or however long this has been going on. We've just been lucky. So that's a long answer. The short answer is examiners can test, for one particular district, can test for any other district. They just have to be doing it under their employed hours for a third-party testing entity under intergovernmental agreement or contract with DMV or ODOT. Answer the question?
Yes. My follow-up question is on the insurance piece. Checking with my risk management department, Eugene School District, and then many others that have reached out. Anybody who sets foot on a school bus is automatically covered by that district's insurance. That's the way that they're set up. That's why Eugene School District has a $30 million umbrella insurance. Salem Kaiser, I'm sure, is up there too. So for the insurance aspect, I guess I'm still a little confused as to why that requirement is in there when anybody, doesn't matter if it's a parent, a chaperone, kids, students that normally don't ride school buses, they're automatically covered once they set foot on by that district.
So is Eugene School District, go ahead.
Just to summarize, for anybody who couldn't hear the question, that's why wouldn't the insurance coverage for your district cover whoever was on that bus when something was happening?
So is Eugene actually insured or are you self-insured?
No, we are actually insured.
Okay, so that would be a legal review of that policy to ensure that's the case then, because we've consulted with our AAG and absolutely said no, not okay. So that may be a fight between some legal counsel between some districts and Department of Justice, but there was, so your district's insured, missing language in that policy, no indemnification language until we recently got that added to those policies. So although there may be a contention that it would cover, the reality is, based on the legal advice we got, not so much. So, and insurance companies are notorious for trying to get out of paying claims, and especially with the state agency that has big pockets like Oregon Department of Transportation or Oregon Department of Education. Once again, surviving member's family files lawsuit against a state agency because we have the deep pockets and the insurance company is fighting paying the claim. I imagine at the very least, state agency is going to settle. Maybe we don't fight it all the way through court, but it's going to be a huge, huge expense for the state agencies. So.
All right. Head from you back there also.
So I'm from a smaller district, and our concern is kind of getting lost in the shuffle. Our tester was shut off for most of last year, so we didn't even have the opportunity to get 10 tests in. And so I'm wondering how the 10 test requirement is going to play into this, and what opportunities, because of all the kind of weird stuff that's been happening with testers, what opportunity the smaller districts are going to have to extend and open up our testers to testing for other districts.
Mm-hmm.
We have had no time to really acquire 10 tests.
And the question was, examiners are required to have 10 tests per year completed without needing some additional refresher training. So to keep that 10 test number up, what about opportunities to test?
So great question. So in doing this, and especially through conducting the evaluation piece, we've really discovered that there is no substitute for test administration, meaning anyone who runs through those motions and they do it over and over and over and over again, they get more proficient at it. And that translates across crafts usually. If the more you do something, the more proficient you become at it. So even though the goal is always 10, certainly, primarily because there's federal regulations that require it, those regulations permit us to administer a refresher training in lieu of those 10 tests. And that's what we currently have in place, is the online refresher training, the curriculum that was developed with ODE and DMV. So, I mean, there's not going to be any initial limitations through the contract agreement piece that you have to get that 10 in, other than what's currently in place right now. So the individuals that are unable to get 10 would still be subject to that process. I would encourage people, like I said, we're going to have to lean a lot on each other to kind of get that frequency of test number up. We see it over and over and over again. We have a lot of examiners in the state that might do one test a year or one test every 2 years, and it never fails. During the evaluation process, they struggle. They have a really hard time because it's just not something that they do very often. So again, I don't know if that really answers your question, but just I think continued working together and trying to get these folks as many tests as possible. And if we have cases where we know someone's only going to do one every 2 years, maybe that's the consideration, that you don't have that resource there for that one test every couple of years.
And since we've started working on transitioning from one model to another, we've been working on collecting those compliance documents. One of those is establishing an agreement between districts. So if you need to assist a neighboring district with examinations, having a written agreement in place kind of helps outline exactly what that's going to look like, who's paying for it, what the financials look like, and what the insurance coverage situation looks like. Clarifying those things allows you to open yourself to do work for other surrounding districts as needed. So was there anything else you had on that? Okay, all right. Terry?
So I'm with Portland, and we have a lot of employees that are coming from Washington. And so we're required to do a Washington test and an Oregon test. With these new changes, I was hearing you say, and maybe I wrongly heard it, but the federal standards are going to be the federal standards. Will we still have to do 2 tests, or will 1 test be sufficient?
So the question is, will, for interstate things, if you're in a city on the border of a state, say you either live in Portland and you hire people from Vancouver, Washington, or you live in Pendleton and you're hiring someone from across the border, or say you're down on the southern part of the state and somebody lives in California, works in Oregon. The question is, what will the requirements be for testing there? And I'll start out with that. For licensure, that's up to the state in which the person resides. So we've got someone living in Washington has to take the Washington CDL exam. The testing in Oregon would be for their school bus certificate, because they need a certificate to operate a school bus in the state of Oregon. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't think there's anything that Oregon DMV would have to say about that.
You're correct. You know, the only add would be is that CDL skills tests are not of out-of-state applicants are not permitted in Oregon across the board. Oregon doesn't test out-of-state residents. So any test that's being administered to someone with a Washington driver's license would be a school bus certification only test, not a DMV CDL licensure test.
And when I lived in Portland and drove a school bus, that was initially my situation. I needed to test in Washington for my license, and then I needed to test in Oregon for my certificate. So that will be the situation for some people who live on or near the border. Yeah, and let me check in real quick. Do we have any online questions at this point?
There are a bunch.
Okay.
I just kind of caught on here from the last person that was
That's all right.
What was the last one? Did you guys do, is there a 10 test requirement?
We kind of talked about that, yeah,
Okay,
from somebody
okay,
here.
so-
Let me give you a chance to catch up with those, and I'll take this one here in the room.
Okay, sure.
Go ahead.
I'm a current third-party tester, so we do an agreement up, right? So you have to apply again to get into it?
Question is, in June, once the memorandum of agreement has expired and new things are put in place, does he need to reapply as a third-party examiner?
You're an examiner or a tester?
Tester, sorry.
Oh, okay, you're a tester.
So what district?
He's an examiner.
Examiner.
Sorry. Tester's the organization, examiner's the one administering the test. So you're an examiner.
So what we're going to be doing is there's going to be a couple of different avenues. So we have the private bus companies, and we also have the school districts. School districts will be able to enter into an intergovernmental agreement directly with DMV for purposes of continuing on in their program. They would just have to fulfill the testing business requirements, employ examiners to administer tests. The bus companies, a little bit different in that there will be a class special procurement, which is a contractual requirement in the state of Oregon for any contractor where we contract out DMV related business or any state agency's business for that matter, a process that they will have to navigate. But Bryce has a little more familiarity with what that looks like. I don't know if you want to, how deep into the weeds you want to go on class special procurement, but.
Yeah, basically it allows us to bypass the normal competitive contracting process. And we say, here are a certain class of entities. These are transit entities. And there may be some private transit entities around the state. We know TriMet's not private. They're quasi-governmental, so we can enter in intergovernmental agreements with them. But for the private bus companies, or let's say if there were like a big consortium of private schools, whatever, right? If they don't meet the statutory definition, the legal definition of a unit of local government, then they're going to have to actually have a contract with us. And by us doing the class special procurement instead of the competitive procurement, they don't have to submit this big proposal for, and we don't have to score them and say, yeah, you meet all these criteria. It's just kind of you're in or you're out, right? If an organization that meets all the criteria and all the qualifications in the class special procurement, we can execute a contract. So once that class special procurement is approved by the Department of Administrative Services and our Assistant Attorney General, then basically we have the contracts ready to go, and we just post it out on the Oregon Procurement Information Network. There's a very simplified response from any of those private entities that want to play in the space, and then we can work on executing an agreement with those entities. For the school districts, for any of the units of local government, it's going to be much more simple because it's just going to be the intergovernmental agreement, which is just like an interagency agreement between one state agency and another, but it's a state agency and a unit of local government. There's no posting on Oregon Procurement Information Network, nothing like that. So all of the organizations that want to play in the space will have to have either an intergovernmental agreement or a contract with us, in which case any examiners that exist already in those organizations can continue to administer tests. So.
And can I have, as far as if someone does, if someone wants to play in this space and they are not a school district, how would they find out about those opportunities? So you mentioned the place where the marketplace where it's posted.
Yeah. So I already sent an email out to across the state to all of the contacts that ODE maintains, saying, hey, here's a little more detail around what's happening. I need you to get back to me with who your business manager is or whoever would be managing, the contracts. Let me know, give me their contact information. I'm building a new contact list. My next communication out once I have that contact list completed is going to be, okay, now we need to know who wants to play in the space, and whether you are a unit of local government or are you a private entity, and So that way we can start having those conversations about, here's the path you're going to go down. And we can tell them, okay, you're a private entity, so you've got to register on the Oregon Procurement Information Network, and you got to be, so you get the alert when, the announcement hits. We'll also send you an email out saying, okay, the announcement hit, for the class special procurement, follow the instructions, right, on ORPN. And so we'll be getting communication out to the entities based on their status, what they are. And then we also, when it comes to the insurance stuff, we have to make sure that we have those very specific and detailed conversations with the entities about, are you a public body as defined by the Oregon Tort Claims Act? Some entities that are small districts may not be a public body as defined by the Oregon Tort Claims Act, so they're not going to be necessarily covered under that. So there are certain conversations we need to have around, once again, the insurance and the bonding and or the self-insurance requirements to make sure that all of the entities are able to meet all the requirements they have to meet in both state and federal regulations. So it's coming.
So they'll be hearing from you, and if they want to make sure they're on that list, we've got your contact information posted on the slide that's up right now. Let me check in with Shauna. You've got a few more questions.
There's quite a few, actually.
Okay. Why don't you give me the first one?
Okay. So can an examiner contract with a smaller district under the Hosting District Liability?
So the question is, how can someone who is a third-party examiner at one site be covered by someone else's insurance?
If they enter into a contract or an agreement, as we can provide some technical assistance of where that would work and where it wouldn't. But yes, essentially you could, through either a personal service contract that a district could employ for one person and then issue a 1099 or take them on as an employee under a limited term duration. So either of those could work.
Yeah, and as we described before, the coverage is important there, just to make sure that the coverage exists. We have another one?
Next one, okay. Will DMV or ODE allow existing third-party examiners to be certified to administer tests at multiple test sites?
Multiple test sites. Can it be done?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yep.
So DMV will sign on.
And currently, and I can shed a little more light on this. I know that right now there's limitations around test sites and where folks can administer tests based on whether they're approved or not approved. But within the current CDL third-party testing program, we don't place any limitations on site other than what Bryce has alluded to around employment, making sure the proper coverages are in place. But as far as limitations on where you can or can't test, that would be between you and your employer as long as the applicable coverages are in effect.
And currently, for ODE's purposes, we only allow for one assigned location. So that is something that we'd have to discuss as time goes forward.
And, I think in a lot of geographic areas, it's been the practice to send the examiner around to administer the tests in different locations. Remember, we can send the drivers to the examiner as well, and that could be a reasonable expectation. So the examiner is not having to travel and spend even more time away from their primary employment. You have a prospective driver, it's not unreasonable to expect that prospective driver to travel to where the examiner is located.
We've got a few more hands in the room here. Let me take Craig real quick.
That model's been tried twice, and presently the goal that we have at this point has been to keep the examiner in one spot so they're familiar with the test route and they're not getting exposed to communities that they're unfamiliar with. So we've tried both models. Presently, the one we're on right now, we fix them to a specific location.
Yeah, to repeat.
And that's the history behind why we're doing it today.
ODE has tried both models,
yeah.
And currently we prefer to have an examiner familiar with the route that they're doing the exam on. Another hand in the back of the room there.
I just wanted to confirm with what Candace, what you just said. Independent contractor agreements are acceptable?
So if Eugene School District, if you were going to enter into a personal service contract with an entity, yes, because you are employing them essentially as an examiner under your already existing structure and relationship with DMV, right? So that is allowable. I would say reach out to us for technical assistance to make sure we can provide some guidance and opportunities of where that could go wrong and how we could support you.
Yeah, and we would need to consult on that too, just to make sure that whatever those we got to be careful when we start talking about the term subcontracting, right? Because it can get a little sticky. So if there are conversations need to happen around that, we'll need to talk offline.
Contractor agreement and intergovernmental agreement are two separate things.
Agreed.
Yes.
And that's why we're offering technical assistance rather than telling you flat out you can do something or you can't, because we want to make sure that you have the right answer.
And I think each situation is going to be a little different and a little complex and nuanced. And so what happens in Eugene is going to be really different than what happens in Redmond, and how we establish those relationships both with DMV and then how we can support you with your business office and with your superintendent to understand that relationship of personal service contracts not as a subcontractor, they're part of your employment. And what is covered with your insurance under PACE if you're there, or if you have private insurance. And so, I would just really encourage in each of those situations to ask for assistance and guidance, and we can walk you through opportunities there.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we got to be careful from our side, because we're accountable to FMCSA for compliance in this program. And we had a situation last year that went sideways with an examiner testing for another geographic area that did not go well. And something happened that absolutely should not have happened. So for our purposes, we've got to make sure that we have sufficient oversight. And if there are some weird kind of subcontracting things going on, we got to know what's going on with that. And we got to make sure that we feel confident that the proper oversight by the third-party testing entity over the administration of that testing is happening. Or that's something that we wouldn't be okay with, based on, like I said, kind of a situation that was not good last year. Let's just put it that way. So, sorry.
Shauna, do you have another one?
Yeah, so this was more of a comment of like what they'd like to see. It would be nice if you would put up a step-by-step chart or a list of what needs to take place for a school district or rural with no tester or trainer to obtain a driver with no CDL. Show current process and then show future process.
I'm just going to put this back up because the process itself, the question was, it'd be helpful to have a chart that explains the process for a rural district. The bones of the process are not going to look much different than this. This is the standard process, and these are the steps that everyone needs to go through to drive a school bus in the state of Oregon. That being said, if we do have situations where, say, the examiner is located off-site, we're talking about a rural district that doesn't have their own training resources, doesn't have their own examiner resource, or any of the other pieces that they need in order to have examinations close by and at hand. There are those additional steps. So I'm making a note here. Maybe I can help piece together some things that would assemble resources for these steps if you're in a situation where you can't easily provide one or more on your own. So we'll come back to that. Do you have a contact for that person? You don't have to share it now, but if that person's identified,
Yes, it is.
I'll try and make this available broadly, but I want to make sure I target that person as well. So, yes. And was there another one there?
Yes. Have you contacted ESDs in respect to having a third-party tester or a CDL trainer?
So educational service districts, where do they stand in this whole mix?
So an ESD can choose to be part of the same agreements that a local school district could. At this moment, we don't have ESDs that are operating transportation units in that capacity, but they could essentially under that structure. I'm looking to Craig for some historical components on that, but at this moment, that's not part of, it's not part of the purview of their work. And so I would say, based off of my relationships with our ESDs, that it would be a new adventure, but it's definitely not a possibility we couldn't explore.
And who doesn't love an adventure?
We had a question in the back.
All right.
I just wanted to ask about the inactive examiners. For instance, my department, our active tester is probably only going to be a couple more years, and then they're going to give it up. And I have 2 inactive testers. So how is that going to work moving forward as far as activating an inactive?
So the question is, will anything change when you have examiners that are currently in active status with DMV? You want to bring them back online so they can start doing examinations? Is there anything that would be different about that process going forward? Not
as far as we know. I mean, the difference is currently, I know you guys reach out to the Oregon Department of Ed. Oregon Department of Ed sends a request through to us. But examiners will be operating as extensions of their testing business, meaning if their testing business wants to bring them on to administer tests, they would be able to do that. The proper training would have to be in place, and then, of course, the assurances that the testing business is certain that the examiner is proficient at that stage, because that's a responsibility that ODE used to assume prior to this shift. So that responsibility would fall back on the testing business. But essentially, the difference would be, as long as you have the appropriate credential, the examiner's certificate, at least for the skills testing piece, your district or bus company could bring you on as an employee as long as you've had the training and know how to administer tests.
I think the important, piggyback on this a little bit, we mentioned a little bit earlier too. If a person gets their examiner training in January and doesn't administer a single test all year long, and then all of a sudden goes to administer a test in December, what's the likelihood they're going to properly administer and score that test?
Pretty low.
It's a problem, right? And if that were to result in unsafe driver being put out on the road, not good for kids, not good for the general public. So once again, we talked about in one of the earlier slides about the duties, obligations, and responsibilities of the third-party testing entities. It's on the organization to make sure, if they have someone who's trained, had the background check, currently has an active examiner certificate, what is that third-party testing organization going to do if all of a sudden they want to activate someone who's not been administering tests? What is that third-party testing organization going to do to ensure that person can competently administer tests? As long as there's a plan in place for that third-party testing organization to make sure that that person can go out and administer tests well, whether that's, coordinating with ODE or another third-party tester or a trainer or whatever, but, it's incumbent upon that third-party testing entity to make sure that person's okay and is competent and going to be capable in properly administering the test.
All right. Was there another question online?
Yes, there is. Where can I find the guidelines for the IGA to give to my legal department? When will this be made available?
All right. I know that as ODE, we were sending out some example language. We're not prescribing anything, but we definitely have some examples of what an IGA, an intergovernmental agreement, could look like. That, of course, is something that you want to check with your own legal counsel, make sure that it fits spec for what you're doing. And like Candace was saying,
we will actually have that.
And you've got some as well.
We will have the intergovernmental agreement. We have the content, all of the materially significant program-specific content that is required by federal and state regulation. Nick and I just finished going through that statement of work and the contract language that we need. We have a few tweaks that we need to make, and we got to drop it into the intergovernmental agreement template. That has to go to our Assistant Attorney General for review. All intergovernmental agreements require AAG review from Department of Justice. Once we get the approval from our AAG, then we will have an intergovernmental agreement that we can send out to the individual districts for them to review with their business, their legal counsel, whatever, to make sure they are good with it before we actually execute them.
So that's separate. That relationship and that intergovernmental agreement is going to be a separate relationship than if you have local districts in that space. And so we can provide assistance and model language about how to do that. If Eugene and Springfield are going to partner together and need some contract language and coverage in that, different than the relationship that Bryce is talking about.
Sorry, I thought that was what was being referred to, was the intergovernmental agreements with us.
And there's a lot of paperwork going around, so
okay.
Yeah, it can be tricky to keep it all straight. But yes, depending on the need, we're both around and can assist for the appropriate need. All right. Other one from you?
I think this person's just asking if the statement is correct because they have a question mark. A third-party tester is a certified driver training entity that has been approved to offer the road skills testing at their facility. A third-party examiner is a certified driver training instructor who has been approved to administer the road test skills to students.
And I think we've already covered that,
Okay.
that definition a couple times here, but yeah, the examiner is the organization, or excuse me, the tester is the, you see how tricky it is. The tester is the organization approved to offer examinations to prospective drivers, and the examiner is the person conducting that test.
I would clarify, though, that statement says trainer and training organizations, not necessarily trainers or training organizations.
Right. Training is a completely different deal, and that's obviously, no matter where you get your exam, you want to make sure that you've prepared for it. But for ODE's purposes, an ODE certified trainer is the one doing the preparation for a prospective school bus driver.
And some individuals may wear both hats. They may be a trainer and also a skills test examiner, but it's different training to be trained to be an examiner versus being trained to be a trainer, right? Train the trainer versus examiner training. And again, just that reminder that of not administering a test to someone you've also trained.
Got a hand back here.
Question for Nick.
Yeah.
Just a clarification. You talked about every couple of years you guys came and audited us, so that's going away, and you're supposed to go through essentially for training or to get re-audited?
So you're correct, yes.
The question is,
sorry, Rob, go ahead.
Is there going to be a difference? We described a little bit about the examination or the examiners and their evaluations. So I think that's what you're referring to, is how well are you doing as an examiner? And so the question is that changing?
So yes, the current change that we've had and we've been doing for the last couple of years is, rather than visiting each individual examiner on site, doing the half a day thing where we pour over records and we go out, we do the evaluation. We've been bringing everyone in together, doing the evaluations en masse. We have essentially mock applicants. ODE has been participating, providing drivers for 3 vehicles. We're simultaneously running pre-trip, BCS, road test portions of the test, and then we're cycling people through. It takes approximately a half day, but we're able to actually get, I think one day we did as many as 12.
We had 12 in one day.
We got as many as 12 folks through in one day. And again, most of the feedback coming out of that is positive. We have gotten some other feedback as well, but most of it's been positive, and that's the big difference there. Yeah, it's rather than going to you on site, folks are coming in. We're doing it at the Oregon School for the Deaf, or that's where we have been doing those evaluations. Once every 2 years, correct. Yep.
Right, and there's always been an allowance if someone isn't able to make it to a centralized evaluation event. You've been willing to meet them depending on what the situation is and what the need is.
You're correct. Yeah, there's a couple of folks that just were not able to get in under the wire, and then we've made accommodations to actually get out to those folks. So
the flu was rough this year.
Yes.
Now that assumes you're actually testing well. If you're not testing well, you might see Nick more frequently, actually. He might come down and pay you a visit.
Right. Another hand in the back here.
I have a follow-up with that. So that's in regards to auditing or evaluating your third-party examiners. How is that going to look for renewal of a third-party exam?
Okay, so the question was, how is that going to affect the renewal of third-party examiner? As Nick mentioned, there's no longer an application process for the examiners. So, in other words, once as an examiner, you are employed by a third-party tester, you've gotten your training, you're administering your tests, you're staying up on any retraining that's required, whatever, your evaluations are good, it just keeps on, your examiner certification just keeps on trucking.
Yep.
So.
All right. So is the audit portion of the record, is that no more?
The question being, if the evaluation of a third-party examiner, if that, what was that, it becomes part of it?
The record portion of the audit, because we're now auditing, Nick, if you will, the skills in administering a test. How about the paperwork?
So will there be paperwork follow-up? That's the question.
Great question. So, so that is actually a federal requirement that exists currently. It's a once every 2 year requirement, just like the evaluation. The inspection requirement actually exists at the organizational level, not the examiner level, meaning we don't have to do each individual person. Because we've done record inspections associated with the Oregon Department of Education, they're currently the testing business, we've met that requirement across the board, so we haven't been people, trucking their paperwork to these evaluations that we're doing in mass. Moving forward, we're going to have to come up with something more creative. I know one of the ideas that we've been mulling over as a requirement for the program going forward is potentially requiring paperwork to be uploaded into systems, because it does offer us that option. And then we could complete our record inspection piece internally. You wouldn't have to worry about fulfilling that need because we would have access to it. But that's just one idea, not to say that's the route we're going to go. But once we execute new agreements, new contracts with everyone, that 2-year clock starts ticking as far as hitting those inspection requirements. We'll have to figure out something pretty quick.
All right.
Yep, so who is in charge, DMV or ODE?
Who is in charge?
I would say, so
That's where we point at each other.
right? So it depends on the oversight. It depends on the question being asked. Right? So when it comes to buses and all things that are around the bus certification, the Oregon Department of Education holds that burden of responsibility and service, right?
And I would say probably who's ultimately in charge is the federal government, who places a lot of requirements on both of us. We're both working to make sure we meet those requirements. And yes, again, if it's questions about your school bus certificate, that's something that ODE is in charge of and takes care of and administers. If it's something about your commercial driver license, that's something that falls in DMV's camp. So who's in charge?
I think I'll just say we're in charge. We're just gonna bully these two.
I shouldn't have left that up on the table. No. But yes, it is. It's a cooperative relationship, I'd like to think. So yes. Yeah, these ODE has been great. In all honesty, this whole thing blew up on us really quickly last year, and when it came down to needing to get some interim solutions in place, Candace and Brock have been fantastic. We turned around probably about 4 to 6 months worth of work in about 2 weeks to get the interim agreement in place, to get some more legally sufficient language in place, and to kind of do what we need to do. And then the districts and school bus companies responded with turning around the memorandums of agreement that we needed done really quickly. So everybody, had a part to play. There's not really a boss or in charge. It's really more collaboration, working together to try and resolve this thing. But when it comes to accountability to FMCSA, unfortunately, that's on us. And they do hold our feet to the fire. And we have annual program reviews. They come out and they ask lots of questions, and they look at things and they say, is our federal or is our state CDL program compliant with federal regulations? And all the places they find where we are not, we get findings. And then we have to come up with action plans to address those findings. And if they don't like our action plans or they're not sufficient, we run the risk of decertification of our CDL program, which would mean
the entire state.
Yeah, which would mean no one could get a CDL, an interstate CDL in the state of Oregon. We also run the risk of the loss of federal highway funds. So it's a big stick that the U.S. Department of Transportation wields as far as ensuring that we as a state are compliant with those federal regulations. So once again, not really in charge, but we're kind of the point of the spear in the state for CDL compliance. And then ODE has that school bus driver certification responsibility of oversight for that. So we kind of have to, we're forced to work with these two, even if we didn't want to.
And you've all seen Mad Max. We can't go that direction. There's something I think that's important as well, that ultimately, who's in charge? The people that we serve are the constituents in our local communities whose kids go to our schools that need service provided to them, and I think that's who we're ultimately working for. So, another question up there?
Yeah, what is the timeline for DMV to send out the contract language for the IGA?
All right, timeline for the contract language specifically. Bryce, you mentioned that you guys have some things that you'll be sharing. Do we have a timeline for that?
So for the intergovernmental agreements for the school districts, we're going to have it in the hands of our AAG within 2 weeks, tops. So it's just dependent upon how long our AAG takes to review and get comment back to us, and whether she finds any significant edits need to be made. I doubt it, because we've worked through this content pretty thoroughly, and we started with something we knew was already legally sufficient because it had AAG review. We started with something that already had AAG review as our base, as our foundation, and then we just modified the materially specific content we needed for this particular purpose. So the AAG review should go pretty quickly, but there are a lot of pages to it, and she has other things she has to do for us. So it really is dependent on how long our AAG takes, but I would say we may be ready to start talking to the districts about the intergovernmental agreements as early as March. So that, I'm not worried about the timeline for the intergovernmental agreements with the school districts. I'm more worried about whether we're going to hit the timeline for the class special procurement for the private entities, because that has to go through more approvals and it has to go through the Department of Administrative Services, and sometimes they are slow. So because they're understaffed and they have a bunch of new people, they have a bunch of new people in their contracts and procurement area, and they've had some turnover in that group. And so my understanding is their approvals are taking a while. So we're going to have to push, and maybe a little political push to get the class special contracting in place in time.
Question, because of potential be a headache. The contractors, will that be open? In other words, a new contractor comes in the state, will that option be open, or will there only be windows when that can be available?
Okay,
that group is not easy to, they don't swap off very well.
Yeah. So the question is, in the contracting, basically how frequently we're going to be able to do that, or if it's going to be open. So no, so we're running 3 things concurrently. We have the intergovernmental agreements we'll be doing with the school districts. We have the class special procurement will be a one-time gig with the transit entities, right? Private school bus companies and any private public transit entities. And then we have this competitive procurement where we are going out and soliciting for-profit third-party testing entities. Anybody who doesn't fit into option A or option B, they're going to be option C, right? And we currently have private for-profit third-party testing entities we have that were under agreement with us. So it's more of those entities that will hold that procurement. It will close, we'll award contracts, and then it's not going to be open continuously. In other words, we would have to repost on the Oregon Procurement Information Network every time we want to solicit for new organizations. Does that answer your question, Craig?
It creates a problem.
Yeah, kind of the way it has to be run for the...
If a national contractor wanted to come in the state, the way the present structure is, they could come in, how are they going to get their people tested?
And we're talking about contracts to do third-party examination, correct?
Yeah. Right now, we have 3. Yeah, 3. If there were a 4th coming in, how would they take care of that?
So, you're talking about the school bus company. So that would be easier. That's not a competitive procurement. That falls under the class special procurement. That's a lot easier to open up again.
Okay, so you could open it up to bring...
Yeah, that's a lot easier to open and reopen, and we don't have to go through the complicated scoring we have to do in the
Okay, that's the question.
Yeah.
And we're talking...
That's not overly burdensome.
Yeah, as compared to finding another company to offer third-party examinations that doesn't currently exist.
Yeah.
So we're creating a distinction between private bus companies and some other third-party testing organization that doesn't necessarily do school bus service.
Yeah.
All right. What else do we have on here?
Okay, so if you currently are an inactive third-party examiner, how do you now reactivate?
I think we went over this already. There shouldn't be any change to the way that someone reactivates as an inactive examiner. It would be the same process that they do currently. So if someone's at your district and they have been trained to be a third-party examiner but aren't currently active, it would be the same process as before. All right.
Anything? Did you want to add anything on that, Nick?
No, I mean, that's it. And it depends for the reason for being inactive too, and if there were reinstatement requirements or stipulations placed around reactivation, then you would still have to meet whatever those requirements are. But the crux of it's the same, in that the process shouldn't necessarily be any different.
Right now, we're restricted to 2 active examiners. Is there a chance of that changing?
The question, is there a chance that there would be a different number than 2 examiners at a location?
How many tests is your employer, or how many tests are you administering out of that site or that location? 28 already this year?
Well, this school year, sorry, I'm.
Oh, okay. No. I'm like, wow. Yeah, I don't see why not. Again, the 10 test minimum is kind of the identified standard as far as the federal regulations are concerned. And if I'm being perfectly honest, 10 probably isn't enough. I mean, from what we see from these evaluation cycles, the examiners that are doing 20, 30 plus are usually coming in far more prepared than the ones that are barely hitting their 10. That's not to say that folks that barely get their 10 can't do it. It's just the ones that do more are more proficient. So I would say that's more of a decision at your organizational level. Obviously, we can only support so much infrastructure in the terms of evaluations and everything else, and we haven't found a need. I would discourage people from ramping up in that regard just because it hits against that minimum number of tests. But again, as far as the contractual relationship exists, at least initially, there's not going to be any prohibitions around how many people they can have administering tests. I would just say, obviously, make responsible decisions in that regard.
All right.
Can I have a follow-up to that?
Follow-up question here.
Being an inactive tester, it's hard to get practice like you suggested. So you said it's up to the organization to find a way for that person to get the practice. Do you allow inactive testers to follow an active tester to see what they're doing?
So if someone is not practiced at giving an examination, what opportunities exist for them to kind of get back in the game?
That's a Division 60 issue.
I believe you're right, Craig. I know that there are certain limitations that are placed around who can be on the vehicle during tests, and that they have to wear one of the specific hats. And if that person isn't actively in that role, it might be a challenge for that to happen. That doesn't mean that, the organization can't create some sort of mock environment, maybe where they set time aside for you to monitor, to screen, to learn and grow from. But yeah, Craig is correct. There are some limitations around what you can and can't do in those situations.
That being said, we do have the refresher training that is online, so that helps you build up the knowledge base. In order to pass that test, you have to go through that training. So there's that. And then I don't know that anyone relishes the idea of going back to third-party class for a huge refresher, but it's always a possibility. If someone wanted to enroll, they could come back for more.
There are opportunities for you to test even when you're inactive.
Yeah.
ODE allows for you to do your MV tests, your ODE tests, your Type 20 tests. So avail yourself of those to keep your skill level up.
Scott just reminded us, yes, that school bus tests are something that ODE requires for certain people. It's not a DMV thing, but it is a similar skill set to giving a third-party exam. So that is one way that you could maintain a skill set there. And he says avail yourself, which, yes, look for those opportunities if you need to practice.
No more questions.
All right. We've come to the end of the list online. So if anyone else attending online has a question, they should put it in now. Are there any further questions in the room? Well, this has been an hour-and-a-half rodeo. I appreciate everybody hanging on. Thank you all for being here, either here physically or here online. We appreciate you taking the time and making sure that you know what you need to know. And again, the bottom line is that we have what we need to serve our communities well, to transport our students safely. And that's the reason that we're here. So we appreciate the work you do. Thank you for your time.
Oh, actually, I want to jump one more thing in there before you give them the sign off. Hopefully we didn't have too many people already check out. But I just want to encourage you, this is Bryce with DMV, just want to encourage you, if you know for certain that your geographic area, your organization wants to play in this space by entering into an intergovernmental agreement or a contract with ODE DMV, contact me, let me know, make sure that your organization has been in touch with me. Like I said, I'm building the contact list, so I know exactly who all we need to be communicating with. Also, on the flip side of that coin, if you're absolutely certain or you're relatively certain that the district you work for or the location you work for has no intention of playing in the space and operating and functioning as a third-party testing entity under intergovernmental agreement or contract with DMV, please let me know. As I build this list, that's good to know. We can start identifying where our gaps in coverage are geographically around the state, start overlaying that on a map and see where we have areas of risk or areas of coverage that we need to be working with ODE on to try to find some ways to make sure that we have statewide coverage. So that'll be one of the things that we do here relatively soon, is building kind of that graphic and that overlay so we can easily see with a visual representation of where we have good coverage and where we don't.
All right. Was there anything else, questions online?
There is.
All right.
They're wanting to know, is this webinar available online?
This webinar will be archived, and we'll make sure that you have a link to that. Let me put my contact back up on the screen real quick. My email is the best way to get in touch if you'd like to view this again, whether you got to see it this time around or not. So, yeah, send your inquiries my way, and we'll try and make sure we get that link to the archived session available so you can go back to it. Want to say thank you again to our technical team, Shauna, Flo, Kylie, Mary, and Heather. Thank you so much for helping us get this all put together. We greatly appreciate it. Again, this is us, Candace Pelt, the Assistant Superintendent of Student Services. I'm Brock Dittis, the Operations Policy Analyst for Department of Education. Bryce McKenna, the Driver Programs Manager, and Nick Hopper, Third Party Programs Compliance Coordinator for DMV. So thank you again for your time, and check in. Do be in touch with your questions and concerns.
All right.